And I thought about something my mother once told me, decades before any of this happened. She said, "Margaret, time is honest. It shows you who people really are, eventually. You just have to wait." I had waited, and I had been right. But here's the thing that nobody expected. And this is where this story becomes something I never could have imagined. When Robert called me from the hospital, his voice was weak. It was different from how he'd sounded in all those years with Bethany. When he'd learned to speak in this easy, confident way, as if he'd finally become the man he was always meant to be. Now he sounded like the man I'd actually known. The man who used to hold my hand in the morning. The man who was afraid. He said, "Margaret, I need help. I don't have anyone else. Bethany's gone, the children are busy, and I'm scared. I'm really scared." And I made a choice in that moment that my therapist still asks me about. I said yes. Sometimes silence hurts more than words. Comment true if you've ever felt that pain. Because I was silent about what I thought of Bethany. I was silent about my hurt. I was silent about my worth. And that silence almost cost me everything. But in saying yes to Robert, I discovered something about myself that I didn't know existed anymore. I discovered that love isn't something that dies just because someone stops feeding it. It goes quiet. It goes deep. It waits. And sometimes, when you least expect it, when you've made peace with never having it returned, you discover that it was never really gone at all. I moved into the guest room of my son's house, where Robert had to stay during his recovery. And for 3 months, I cared for a man who had left me, betrayed me, and made me invisible. I cared for him with the same hands that had held him through our first marriage, that had always been willing to hold him even after he chose someone else. But something happened during those 3 months that changed everything. Robert started to understand, and I started to understand too. And there was a secret that nobody knew about, a secret that would reshape the entire story my children thought they knew. A secret that Bethany had kept from everyone, including Robert. A secret that would explain why she'd really left, why she'd really been willing to discard him so quickly, and what she'd been doing all those years with a man who thought she loved him. I want to take you back to something. Back to a time when I still believed that if you loved someone enough, if you sacrificed enough, if you showed up enough times, they would eventually choose you. I want to show you the woman I was before. I learned that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes it's not even close. It was a Thursday evening in 1989. I remember this detail because my daughter had a soccer game that afternoon, and Robert had promised to be there. He wasn't, but I filmed it anyway, on our old camcorder, the kind with the tape inside that you had to rewind. When he came home that night, I showed him the footage. I didn't show it to make him feel guilty. I showed it because I wanted him to see our daughter score her first goal. I wanted him to see what he'd missed. He watched it for about 30 seconds and then looked away. He said, "I got caught up at work, Margaret. Not everything is about the kids." I remember thinking, that was such a strange thing to say. Of course not everything was about the kids, but some things were. Some moments were. And I thought he understood that when we got married. He did understand it, actually. He understood it perfectly in the beginning. I think that's what makes it hurt more. It's not like he never knew how to be a good husband and father. He just decided, at some point, that being that person was too much work, that the version of himself who cared about a little girl's soccer game was too small for who he wanted to become. I should have seen it coming. Not with Bethany, but the general trajectory of him leaving. The signs were all there, written in the small ways he stopped showing up. Promotions at work that meant later nights. Investments that required his attention. A new golf group on Saturdays. Each one was reasonable on its own. Each one made sense. But together, they spelled out a message that I was becoming less important. That our marriage was becoming less important. That staying was harder than leaving. By the time Bethany appeared, I'd already been preparing for his disappearance without even knowing it. I remember the first time I met her. Robert brought her to our house not to introduce her, but because he needed to pick up some documents for their business lunch. That's what he called it. He'd said it so casually, like it wasn't a lie. And maybe in his mind it wasn't. Maybe he'd already rewritten the story so many times that he believed it. This beautiful young woman in our kitchen wasn't a threat to our marriage. She was just a colleague. She was just convenient. She was just temporary. She stood in my living room, that room I'd spent months decorating, where we'd had Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations and quiet nights reading by the fire, and she looked around like she was appraising it, like she was mentally calculating its worth and deciding it wasn't enough. She was polite to me. That was almost worse than if she'd been cruel. Her politeness was the politeness of someone who'd already decided you didn't matter. She called me Mrs. Patterson the entire time, and Robert didn't correct her. He didn't say, "That's Margaret. We've been married for 28 years. She's my wife." After they left, I sat on my couch and held a pillow against my chest. I didn't cry. Instead, I called my best friend, Ellen, and I said, "I think Robert is going to leave me." Ellen laughed. She actually laughed and said, "Oh, Margaret, you're being paranoid. Look at you two. You're solid." But Ellen didn't see what I saw. Ellen didn't feel the way a wife feels when her husband stops looking at her the way he used to. Ellen was my closest friend for 34 years. We'd met at a PTA meeting when our kids were in elementary school. She knew Robert almost as well as I did. She knew his habits, his moods, the way he liked his coffee, and the fact that he cried at movies even though he tried to hide it. Ellen was the person I told everything to. We had a tradition every Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We'd have tea in my kitchen and we'd talk about life, real conversations, the kind where you take off the mask you wear for everyone else. When Robert left, Ellen called me every single day for 3 weeks. She brought me soup when I couldn't eat. She sat with me in silence on nights when talking felt impossible. She was the person who reminded me that I was still valuable, still worthy, still loved, even though my husband had decided I wasn't enough. And then, slowly, without me noticing at first, she stopped calling as often. She started mentioning that she and her husband had been invited to a dinner party that Robert and Bethany were hosting. At first, I said, "Go have fun," because I wanted Ellen to be happy. But then she started telling me about the dinners, about how much fun Bethany was, about how she had this energy that was just so refreshing, about how she and her husband had never seen Robert so happy. I remember the moment I realized that my best friend was choosing my husband's new wife over me. We were having tea, our Tuesday tradition, though by then it was maybe once every other month instead of every weekend. Ellen was showing me pictures on her phone from a party at Bethany and Robert's new house, their beautiful new house that they'd bought with money that was supposed to be mine. Ellen was smiling as she showed me the photos, and I was smiling too, but inside, I felt something break, not violently, just quietly, just the sound of a friendship, a loyalty, a kind of love quietly breaking. I said to Ellen, "Do you ever feel like I've become someone's ghost? Like I'm still around, but I'm not really here anymore?" And Ellen, who was looking at her phone and not at me, said, "Oh, Margaret, you're just being dramatic. Everyone still loves you. You're just going through a phase." A phase, as if 34 years of friendship could become a phase, as if my entire identity could be rearranged because I was no longer attached to a man everyone wanted to be around. I stopped calling Ellen after that, not dramatically, just quietly. I let the Tuesday tradition die without a funeral. I didn't show up the next Tuesday, or the one after that. And Ellen, my best friend for 3 decades, didn't call to ask where I was. That was when I started to understand something about the world. People love you when you're useful. They love you when you're connected to power or money or relevance. They love you when being around you makes them feel better about themselves. But when you become a reminder of something painful, when you become a symbol of loss or failure or the passage of time, they stop. They just stop. And they're not even cruel about it. They're polite. They're kind even. They're just somewhere else. But there was one person who never stopped showing up. My granddaughter, Sophie. She was only 8 years old when Robert left. She didn't understand what was happening exactly. She just knew that her grandfather was living in a different house now, and that her grandmother me seemed sad all the time even though I was smiling. Sophie lived with David and his wife, which meant I saw her a few times a month, and each time, without being asked, without being prompted by anyone, she would take my hand and she would ask me about my day. She would show me her drawings from school. She would curl up next to me on the couch and ask me to tell her stories about when I was young. She would look at me with eyes that still believed I mattered. I remember one afternoon, maybe 2 years after Robert left, Sophie asked me why I looked sad so much. I told her I wasn't sad. I was just tired. And she said, in that way that children have of seeing right through you. You're sad because Grandpa left, right? My teacher said that when people leave, it makes you sad. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to make Sophie feel like she had to comfort me, but I also didn't want to lie to her. So I said, yes, sweetheart. Sometimes when people leave, it does make you sad. But you know what? Your being here makes the sad smaller. Do you know that? Sophie climbed into my lap. She was too old, really. At 8 she was getting too big for that. But she did it anyway, and she said, then I'll stay. I'll stay with you so the sad gets smaller. And I held my granddaughter and I cried. For the first time since Robert told me he was leaving, I actually let myself cry. And it was because someone so small, so young, so insignificant in the eyes of the world, had just shown me more love than anyone I'd loved as an adult. If you've ever given everything to your family and still felt invisible, tap heart symbol so I know you exist. Because that's what it felt like, being invisible. And sometimes the only proof that you're real is a child who sees you anyway. But Sophie's presence only made it more painful to watch my family drift away. Because it meant I had to witness, over and over, what real love looks like, and then watch everyone around me fail to practice it. David was a good father to Sophie. He showed up to her soccer games and her school plays. He held her when she was sick. But with me, he was polite. He was distant. He was the kind that doesn't actually help because there's no warmth in it. His wife, Catherine, was worse. She was the reason the visits became shorter. She was the reason David started making excuses about why I couldn't come over. She was the reason, I suspect, that he called me on that morning and called me a burden. Catherine had never forgiven me for being Robert's wife. I'd never quite understood why. Until one night when I overheard a conversation between her and David. It was a Friday. I'd come to pick up Sophie for the afternoon. But Catherine said, David was in the shower and asked if I wanted to wait in the kitchen. I said I'd wait in the living room instead, the way I always did. But their voices drifted through the wall, and I didn't cover my ears the way I should have. Catherine was saying something about how unfair it was that I got to be a grandmother when my own husband had treated me so badly. She said, that woman brought it on herself. She was boring. She was boring and bitter, and she let herself go. Why should Sophie have to spend time with her? And David said something back. I couldn't quite hear it, but Catherine went on. She said, mark my words, David, your mother is going to become more of a burden as she gets older, and we shouldn't be the ones who have to handle it. I stood there in the living room, and I let that conversation wash over me. I let it tell me who I was in their eyes, a burden, something that would eventually need to be managed. A problem that time would only make worse. When Sophie and I left that afternoon, I didn't tell her what I'd overheard, but I held her a little tighter. I looked at her a little longer. I memorized the way she smelled like strawberry shampoo in childhood. I thought about how quickly time moves, how soon she would grow up and become someone else, someone who might also see me as a burden. That was also around the time that I started noticing things about Bethany's relationship with Robert. Small things at first. The way she'd speak to him in front of other people with a certain sharpness. The way she'd roll her eyes when he told old stories. The way she'd disappear for hours and come back with gifts that he'd somehow have to pay for. I saw it, but I said nothing. What right did I have? I was the ex-wife. I was supposed to have opinions that didn't matter. But David saw it too. I knew because once, after an uncomfortable family dinner at Bethany's new house, he pulled me aside, and he said, Mom, do you think Dad is happy? And I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, and I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to say, no, sweetheart, your father isn't happy. He's just living the life he thought he wanted, and it's turning out to be hollow. But he'll never admit it, because admitting it would mean admitting that he was wrong. Instead, I said, that's not really my business anymore, David. And he nodded, and he looked away. And I could see him deciding right then to stop asking me things, to stop letting me know him, to become more like his father, more distant. more willing to trade authenticity for appearance. 3 years into Robert's marriage to Bethany, I started noticing something else: financial problems. Robert mentioned them almost casually, the way you might mention the weather. His investments weren't doing as well as he'd hoped. His 401k was being drained. He was worried about retirement. He said all of this to me, his ex-wife, during a chance encounter at the grocery store. And I remember thinking, how strange that he would confide in me. That even after all this time, some part of him still saw me as the person he could tell things to. I didn't ask him questions, but I listened, and I remembered, and I wondered. Then came the day David called me, his voice strangled with something that sounded like shame. He told me that Robert had asked to borrow money, that Bethany had spent enormous amounts on renovations and travel, and that there was nothing left, that Robert, at 70, was going to have to keep working because they were living a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. David said, "Mom, I think Bethany has been spending his money. I think she's been spending it the whole time." I listened to my son realize what I'd already known, what I'd suspected from the very beginning, that his father hadn't left me for love. He'd left me for a fantasy, and that fantasy had a price tag attached to it. But I said nothing about what I knew, because at that exact moment, something shifted inside of me. I realized that I'd been waiting. For years, without knowing it, I'd been waiting for proof, for evidence, for the moment when the world would see what I'd always seen, when everyone would understand that I wasn't the problem, that I had never been the problem. Sometimes the ones we love most are the ones who break us. Comment true if you understand that pain. Because I loved Robert, even as he was destroying our marriage, even as he was choosing someone else, even as he was rewriting our history to make me the villain, I still loved him. And that love, that persistent, stubborn, undeserved love, was about to become the only thing that mattered. Because when Robert called me from that hospital bed, weak and afraid, I didn't say, "This is what you deserve." I didn't remind him of every broken promise or every night I cried alone. I didn't tell him that Bethany had never loved him, that she'd been using him all along, that I'd known it from the very beginning. Instead, I did something that changed everything. I said yes. And then I did something else, something I should have done years ago, something that would finally uncover the truth about why Bethany really left, and what she'd really been doing this entire time. Why her real reason for abandoning Robert in a hospital bed had nothing to do with his illness and everything to do with a secret she thought no one would ever find. A secret that I would discover by accident. A secret that would prove that sometimes the universe does balance the scales. Sometimes the truth does come out. And sometimes the last person anyone expects to be saved is the person who ends up saving everyone. That secret was waiting in the filing cabinet in my guest room, and I would find it in exactly 7 days. No mother deserves to be forgotten. Share this if you still believe love is stronger than greed, because I'm about to show you something that will make you understand that this story was never about heartbreak. It was about justice. It was about a grandmother finding her voice again. It was about discovering that sometimes the woman everyone called a burden ends up being the only person strong enough to save them all. The lawyer's office was cold. That's the first thing I noticed. Not the mahogany desk or the certificates on the wall or the way sunlight cut through the windows in precise geometric patterns. Just the cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and reminds you that you're somewhere important, somewhere permanent, somewhere that holds the weight of decisions made and truths finally spoken. David sat across from me. His hands were folded on the table, and I could see them shaking. Next to him was Catherine, her mouth drawn into a thin line, her eyes fixed somewhere above my head. Robert was there too, though he'd only recovered enough to move in a wheelchair. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished, like the man inside had finally caught up to the aging body. And then there was my lawyer, Margaret Chen, a woman in her 50s with eyes that had seen every version of human betrayal and cruelty. She'd agreed to meet with us because I'd asked her to, because I'd finally, after all these years, decided that silence was no longer an option. I had the file in my hands. I could feel it even though I wasn't looking at it. 7 days it had taken me to work up the courage to open that filing cabinet. 7 days of passing by the guest room where Robert slept, knowing that the truth was waiting there, and knowing that once I pulled it out, once I spoke it aloud, there would be no taking it back. Margaret Chen looked at me over her glasses and she said, "Are you sure about this, Margaret? Once we present this, it cannot be unpresented." I looked at my granddaughter's father, this man who was my son, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He'd come today thinking his mother was going to do something foolish, something desperate, something that would embarrass the family further. He didn't know that I'd finally learned the most important lesson of my life, that the family's shame had never been mine to carry. I opened the file slowly, not for drama, but because my hands were trembling so badly that I could barely grip it. Inside were documents that I'd found stuffed in the back of a drawer that Robert still kept in my house, a drawer he'd apparently forgotten about during his rushed departure all those years ago. Documents that told a story no one had ever bothered to ask about. The first one was a bank statement from an account I didn't have the name of, but that had Robert's social security number on it. An account where money was being transferred every month. Large amounts, $40,000 here, $50,000 there, month after month, year after year. Money that was supposed to have been invested. Money that Robert had told David they needed for living expenses. I slid the statement across the desk toward David without saying a word. I watched his face change as he read it. I watched him calculate in real time what I'd had weeks to process. That his father had been lying. That the financial problems were real. But they weren't caused by Bethany's spending. They were caused by Robert's transfers to an account that Catherine immediately said didn't make sense. "This must be a mistake," Catherine said. "Robert, this is obviously..." But I wasn't looking at Robert. I was looking at David, because I wanted him to see me when I said the next part. I wanted him to look into his mother's eyes and understand that I was still the woman he knew, that I was still capable of protecting him even from the truth. "The account," I said quietly, "belongs to Bethany's father." The room went still. Silence pressed down like a physical thing, like water pressure at the bottom of an ocean. David's face went pale. Catherine made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whisper. And Robert, from his wheelchair, said very softly, "No, no, Margaret. You don't understand what you're talking about." But I did. I understood perfectly. I pulled out the second document. This one was an email chain, printed out and dated and documented, between Robert and Bethany, between Robert and Bethany's father. Conversations that made it clear Robert had been lending money to Bethany's family for years, that he'd been giving them access to his accounts, that he'd been doing all of this while telling David that they were struggling. I found these because Robert asked me to transfer some paperwork from his old desk to the house. I said, keeping my voice steady. He was in the hospital. He couldn't access them. And while I was organizing his files, I found the mortgage documents for the house, the new house that he and Bethany bought. I pulled out the third document, a deed, a property title that showed Robert's name and Bethany's father's name, not Bethany, her father. The house that Robert had spent years paying for was partially owned by someone else, by someone who had made sure, quite carefully, that even if Robert and Bethany's marriage dissolved, even if Robert became unable to pay, the house would belong to the family that was bleeding him dry. David stared at the documents like they were written in a language he didn't speak. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were filled with tears. He said, "Mom, I don't understand. How long have you known this?" 7 days, I said, "since I found the file. And you didn't tell me. You didn't tell Dad." I let that question hang for a moment. I let David sit with the version of me he thought I was, versus the version of me that was actually sitting across from him. The woman who had known, the woman who had waited, the woman who had chosen the right moment to speak. I needed to understand it first, I said. I needed to make sure I wasn't seeing something that wasn't there, that I wasn't interpreting things through the lens of my own hurt. So I had my lawyer investigate, and she found something else. Margaret Chen took over from here, which is what we'd planned. She pulled out a folder, not a photocopy, but an actual folder with official letterhead, and she explained that Bethany and her family had committed fraud. that they had systematically manipulated Robert into giving them access to money and property, that they had done this knowing he was aging, knowing his cognitive function would eventually decline, knowing that they could extract as much as possible before he became unable to consent. She said it all in calm, legal language that somehow made it worse. Because legal language has no room for emotion. It just states what is, what happened, what was done. Catherine began to say something about this being ridiculous, about this being an attack on Robert. When David stood up, he actually stood up from his chair, and he looked at Robert and he said, "Is this true?" And Robert, this man I had loved for so long, this man I had raised children with, this man who had left me for someone he thought was better, Robert just cried. He didn't deny it. He just cried, sitting in his wheelchair, looking at his son. And he cried like a child who had finally been caught doing something he knew was wrong. That's when I felt it. The thing I'd been waiting to feel for so long. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Not even anger anymore. What I felt was sadness. Deep, profound sadness for all of us. For Robert, who had thrown away a marriage and a relationship with his children for a fantasy that turned out to be a trap. For David, who was discovering that his father's weaknesses ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. For Catherine, who was realizing that she'd been punishing me for something I didn't cause. For Sophie, who would grow up knowing that her grandfather had been betrayed, that her family had been divided, that nothing was quite as safe as she'd thought. Have you ever spoken the truth and still been blamed? Tap heart symbol if that pain feels familiar. Because I spoke the truth that day, and I was met with silence. And that silence, it hurt more than anything Robert had ever said to me. But then something unexpected happened. David looked at me, and he said, "I'm sorry." Not to Robert, not to Catherine, to me. And then he said the words I'd waited 15 years to hear from my own son. "I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for doubting you. I'm sorry for believing him instead of believing in you. I'm sorry for calling you a burden." The room seemed to shift. Catherine's face went white. She realized in that moment what was happening. Her certainty was collapsing. The narrative she'd constructed that I was the obstacle, that I was the problem, was unraveling in real time. I reached across the table and I took my son's hand. And I cried. Not quietly, not discreetly. I cried the way you cry when you've been holding something in for so long that it becomes part of your bones. But this wasn't the end of the story. Not quite. Because Margaret Chen had one more document to show us. This one was a will. An old will, dated before Robert married Bethany. A will that left everything to me. Everything. Not because he loved me more than his new wife, though now I knew that was probably true. But because in that will there was a clause that stated very clearly that if anyone engaged in fraud against Robert, if anyone tried to take advantage of him through manipulation or deception, then the entire estate would go to his first wife, not to punish him, but to protect him, to make sure that no one could use his money, his vulnerability, his search for youth and validation against him. Robert looked at that will, and he said, "I never changed it." His voice was barely a whisper. "I meant to. So many times I meant to. But every time I tried, something stopped me. And I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why I kept the old will. Why I didn't move forward with what I supposedly wanted." He was looking at me when he said it, and I understood what he was saying. Some part of him had always known. Some part of him had always remembered who I was, who we were. When family turns against you, the silence hurts more than the words. Comment true if you've lived this. Because the silence after that revelation was the most important silence of all. It was the silence of realizations being made. The silence of egos crashing down. The silence of people understanding, finally, that they'd been wrong about someone they claimed to love. I didn't want Robert's money. I wanted to tell him that. I wanted to tell him that every penny in that will, every property, every investment, I didn't want any of it. I wanted him to be honest. I wanted my son to understand me. I wanted my granddaughter to grow up in a family that didn't reward betrayal and punish loyalty. But before I could say any of that, something else happened. David looked at me and he said, "There's something else, Mom, something I should have told you years ago." He stood up. and Catherine tried to grab his arm to stop him, but he pulled away. When Dad married Bethany, I did some research. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I was curious. I wanted to know who she really was. And I found something. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, and he showed me an article. It was from a newspaper archives website, from 15 years ago. An article about a lawsuit filed against Bethany and her family by an elderly couple. A couple who claimed that Bethany and her father had defrauded them, used their money, isolated them from their children, and then disappeared once the money was gone. The elderly couple's name was Eleanor and Robert Tucker. Not our Robert, but a different one. But the pattern was identical. The method was the same. The predatory precision was unmistakable. When I found that, David said quietly, I wanted to tell you. I wanted to warn you. But by then, you weren't talking to me. You were already becoming the person everyone blamed. And I was ashamed. I was ashamed that I knew and I didn't say anything. That I let you become invisible while I stayed quiet to keep the peace. I looked at my son, this man who I had raised, and I saw him for the first time in years, not as the person who had rejected me, but as the person who had been struggling with his own shame, his own confusion, his own paralysis in the face of a situation that was too big, too complicated, too painful to navigate. Sometimes all you have left is your dignity. Share this if you'd still choose respect over riches. And in that moment, I made a decision. I told Margaret Chen to revise the documents. I told her to find that elderly couple, Eleanor and Robert Tucker. And I told her to make sure they understood that they were not alone. That what had happened to them had happened to my husband. That there was documentation. That there was evidence. That if they wanted to pursue justice, they would have my support, my testimony, and my evidence. I told Robert that I forgave him. Not because what he did was forgivable, but because holding on to my anger was like drinking poison and expecting him to die. And I was tired of dying from things that were never mine to carry. And I told David that I loved him, that I was proud of him for finally speaking, that we had a lot of work to do, but that I believed we could do it, that I believed we could build something real again, something that wasn't based on secrets or shame or fear. Robert, from his wheelchair, said, I don't deserve your forgiveness. And I looked at him, this man who had been my husband, and I said, you're right, you don't, but I'm giving it to you anyway. Not for you, but for me. So I can finally stop waiting for you to be the man I thought you were, and start living as the woman I actually am. If this moment made your heart ache, please like this for every mother who was never heard, because in that moment, I understood that this story was never about Robert leaving me. It was never about Bethany using him. It was about me, finally, speaking my truth and refusing to be silent anymore. But there's one more thing. One final thing that changed everything. As we were leaving the lawyer's office, David pulled me aside, and he said, Mom, there's something else. Something about Bethany. Something that happened last week that no one told you. He told me that Bethany had been arrested, that she and her father had been tracked down by federal authorities, investigating wire fraud, that they were facing charges, that Eleanor and Robert Tucker had come forward, that there were other victims too, 7 other couples. All of them had been systematically defrauded by Bethany and her family. And the evidence that helped break the case open, the documentation that made the prosecutors understand the pattern, it was the file that Robert had kept, the emails, the bank statements, the property documents, the will that he had never changed. Robert had inadvertently preserved the evidence that would put Bethany away. I stood there in that hallway, and I realized something that would reshape everything I believed about justice, about fate, about the strange and mysterious ways that the universe sometimes balances the scales. Sometimes the woman everyone called invisible turns out to be the one who was seeing everything all along. Sometimes the grandmother everyone called a burden turns out to be the one who saves them all. And sometimes, the greatest love you can give is the courage to speak the truth, even when the world is telling you to stay silent. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on your chest and reminds you that everything that happens here matters. Everything that is said here becomes permanent. The judge sat elevated above us all, and I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, Watching the woman I'd once feared destroy herself with her own words, Bethany was testifying. Her lawyer had advised against it, but she'd insisted. She said she wanted to tell her side of the story, that she wanted everyone to understand that Margaret, that's what she called me, as if we were old friends, that Margaret was a bitter ex-wife trying to ruin her life out of jealousy, that everything the prosecutors said was a distortion of the truth. Her voice was steady as she spoke. She was still beautiful in that way that some women are, the kind of beauty that has learned how to perform confidence even when everything inside is crumbling. She talked about how much she loved Robert, how she'd tried to help his family, how Margaret had always been cold to her, how Margaret had tried to turn everyone against her, how this was all just a pathetic attempt by a woman who couldn't hold on to her husband to destroy the woman who could. I watched the jurors' faces as she spoke. I watched them believe her at first, watching their eyes soften, watching them nod slightly as if they understood, as if they'd seen this before. The vengeful ex-wife, the innocent new wife, the classic love story turned to jealousy. But then the prosecutor stood up, and he held up a document, not the ones I'd found, new ones, documents that the FBI had uncovered during their investigation, bank records showing wire transfers to Bethany's father that corresponded exactly to dates when Robert had asked me for help because they were running short on money. Documents showing that Bethany had created fake investment statements. Documents showing that she'd forged Robert's signature on property documents. Documents showing that she'd been systematically isolating him from his children while simultaneously draining his accounts. And then the prosecutor did something I wasn't expecting. He called the other victims. Eleanor Tucker walked into the courtroom and sat down in the witness box. She was 78 years old, with hands that shook as she held the Bible to swear to tell the truth. And she told the courtroom about how Bethany and her father had befriended her and her husband 15 years ago, how they'd manipulated them, how they'd taken everything, how they'd left them with nothing and then disappeared. I watched Bethany's face change as Eleanor spoke. I watched the color drain from her cheeks. I watched her realize that this wasn't about me, that this wasn't about jealousy, that this was about a pattern, a predatory pattern that had caught multiple people in its web. There were 5 other victims, 5 other couples. All of them told similar stories. All of them had been approached by Bethany and her father. All of them had been slowly, carefully, methodically defrauded. All of them had been made to feel like family, like loved ones, before the trap snapped shut. The prosecutor turned to the jury and he said, "This is not a case of a vengeful ex-wife. This is a case of serial fraud. This is a case of elder abuse. This is a case of predation disguised as love." And in that moment, watching Bethany's mask finally crack, I understood something about justice that I'd never quite grasped before. Justice is not about the person who was wronged getting to see their wrongdoer punished. Justice is about truth finally being undeniable. It's about the world being forced to see what you saw all along. Catherine didn't testify. She wasn't charged with anything. She'd been an unwitting participant in her father-in-law's humiliation. But I watched her sit in the gallery, and I watched her face as each new revelation came forward. I watched her understand, layer by layer, that she'd been complicit, that she'd helped isolate me, that she'd called me a burden, that she'd pushed my son away from me, all while the woman she'd welcomed into the family was systematically destroying everything. David didn't look at her once. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of evidence being presented. 3 weeks of Bethany's lawyer trying to poke holes in the testimony of 6 elderly people and finding none. 3 weeks of watching the jury's certainty harden into conviction. On the final day, the prosecutor presented one more piece of evidence, one I hadn't known about until that moment. It was a recording, audio of a conversation between Bethany and her father, made without their knowledge by the FBI. In it, they discussed their strategy. They discussed how to manipulate Robert, how to isolate him, how to extract as much money as possible before he became too mentally compromised to sign documents. The old guys are always the easiest, Bethany's voice said through the speakers in that courtroom. They want to feel young again. They want to feel wanted. You just have to make them feel like they matter, and they'll give you everything. Her father's voice responded, "What about the woman? The ex-wife? Nobody cares about her," Bethany said. "She's invisible. She's old. She doesn't matter to anyone." I felt David take my hand. I felt him squeeze it, not to comfort me, but to ground himself, because he was hearing the woman his father had loved, the woman who had replaced me, callously discuss my worthlessness as if it were fact. When the jury returned with their verdict, it took them less than 4 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Bethany was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Her father was sentenced to 12. As they led her away, she looked back at me. Just once. And in that look, I saw something unexpected. Not remorse. Not regret. Not even anger. What I saw was confusion. I saw a woman who genuinely didn't understand how she'd gotten here. How her manipulation had backfired. How the person she'd called invisible had turned out to be the one who could see everything. I saw her wondering, for perhaps the first time in her life, if she'd made a mistake. But by then it was too late. If seeing truth when gives you hope, tap heart symbol so more people see this. Because in that moment, I realized that this wasn't about me getting revenge. It wasn't about me being vindicated. It was about something much bigger. It was about a system that had failed me, failed Robert, failed all of us. Finally being forced to work the way it was supposed to work. It was about truth mattering more than appearance. About justice mattering more than comfort. But victory, I was learning, comes with a cost. After the trial ended, after the cameras stopped following me, after everyone moved on to the next scandal, the next story, I went home. Back to the house where I'd raised my children. Back to the rooms where I'd waited for my husband to come home, never knowing that one day he wouldn't. Back to the place where I'd felt most invisible, and where I'd somehow found the strength to be the most visible I'd ever been. David came to see me that evening. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Robert had told me he was leaving. The same table where I'd announced that I was going to speak my truth. David looked at me with eyes that were raw from crying. And he said, "Mom, I don't know how to apologize for what I did, for what I didn't do, for how I made you feel." I reached across the table and I touched his face. Not in a motherly way, the way I used to when he was small and scared, but in a way that acknowledged that he was a man now, that he had his own burdens, his own failures, his own journey toward understanding. "You're apologizing now," I said. "That's what matters." "Is it?" he asked. "Is it enough?" Because it doesn't feel like it's enough. And I realized then that the trial, the conviction, the justice, none of it could undo what had happened between us. None of it could return the years I'd spent feeling invisible. None of it could give back the moments I'd missed with my granddaughter because her parents were too ashamed of me to let her see me. Justice is not the same as healing. I was learning that now. For every mother who's been betrayed by her own blood, share this. Because betrayal by family is different from betrayal by strangers. When a stranger hurts you, you can dismiss them. You can move on. But when your own child, when your own family makes you feel worthless, that's something else entirely. That's something that lives in your bones. "I forgave your father," I told David, not because he deserved it, but because I couldn't carry that anger anymore. It was eating me alive. "And now I'm forgiving you too. Not because what you did was okay, but because I need to be free." David cried then. Not quietly. Not with restraint. He cried the way a man cries when he's finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his mistakes. And I held him, this son of mine, this person I'd raised. And I understood that forgiveness isn't about saying that what happened didn't matter. Forgiveness is about refusing to let what happened define your future. But there was still something unresolved. Something that the trial couldn't touch. Something that lived in the space between me and Robert. I saw him 2 days after the verdict. He was still in David's guest room, still recovering. Still trying to learn how to live in a body that had betrayed him and a life that had betrayed him far more profoundly. I brought him tea, the way I used to when we were married. He looked at it like it was a strange object, something he couldn't quite understand. "Thank you," he said. His voice was very small. "You're welcome," I replied. "I don't know what to say to you," he continued. "I don't know how to apologize for something so enormous. I don't know how to explain why I did what I did." "You don't have to," I said. "I understand now. I didn't for a long time. But I do now." "What do you understand?" he asked. I sat down across from him, and I said, "I understand that you were scared. That you were getting older and you couldn't face that. That you looked at me and you saw your own aging reflected back at you. And it terrified you so much that you had to leave. You had to find someone young and beautiful and full of life, so you could pretend that you were still those things." 2 years later, I wake to the sound of birds. I know that sounds like something from a movie, but it's true. Every morning, around 6:30, before the world gets loud, there's this moment where the birds outside my kitchen window remind me that I'm alive, that I made it through, that the days kept coming even when I wasn't sure I wanted them to. My bedroom is different now. I painted it a soft sage green not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to see the color every morning. I wanted my eyes to open to something that felt like peace. The walls are covered with photographs. Real photographs, not the curated ones that used to sit on my shelves. Pictures of Sophie at her soccer games. Pictures of David and me baking cookies in this kitchen. Pictures of my friends from the book club that Ellen never came back to, but that I stayed with anyway, because I learned something important about loyalty. It doesn't require you to tolerate being abandoned. I'm 78 years old now. My hands have more age spots than they did before. My hair is completely gray. I stopped dyeing it about a year after the trial ended. I remember the day I made that decision. I was standing in front of the mirror, and I thought about all the ways I'd tried to look younger. All the ways I'd tried to appeal to a world that had already decided I didn't matter. And I thought, why? Why am I still performing this? Why am I still pretending that my worth is tied to my appearance? I let my hair go gray, and something shifted inside me. It was like I'd finally given myself permission to exist exactly as I was, without apology or explanation. The garden is where I spend most of my time now. I planted it about 8 months after the trial. I bought seeds and soil and I knelt down in the dirt and I planted things. Tomatoes and basil and roses that took 3 years to bloom. I learned, while kneeling in that garden, that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, incremental changes. A seed becomes a sprout, becomes a flower, becomes fruit. You can't rush it. You can only tend to it, day after day, with patience and faith that something will eventually grow. One morning, about a year after I started the garden, I was out there at dawn, watering the roses, and David came out with 2 cups of coffee. He stood beside me in his pajamas. He'd started spending weekends at the house again, and he said, "Mom, I want you to know something. I started therapy. I've been going for 6 months." I didn't say anything. I just kept watering the roses. "I've been processing a lot," he continued. "The shame I felt, the way I treated you, the ways I let Catherine make me believe that you were the problem, when you were never the problem." I set down the watering can and I looked at my son. I said, "David, you were trapped. You didn't know any better. You were caught between your father and me, and you didn't have the tools to navigate that." "That's no excuse," he said. "I know," I replied, "but it's an explanation. And I think explaining things to ourselves with compassion is the first step to healing." He cried then. Not the sharp, desperate crying of the courtroom, but the quiet, sustained crying of someone who's finally letting himself feel something he's been holding back. He cried and I held him, and we stood there in my garden as the sun came up. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like my son was actually present. Not performing, not defending, not hiding, just present. After he went inside, I realized something. I realized that I'd spent so many years waiting for my family to apologize, waiting for them to understand what they'd done, waiting for them to validate my pain. And then, when they finally did, when David finally stood up in that courtroom and said he was sorry, when he finally acknowledged how he'd treated me, when all of that finally happened, it didn't heal me the way I thought it would. Because healing isn't something someone else can give you. Healing is something you have to do for yourself. I learned to cook again, not because anyone asked me to, but because I realized that the act of creating something, of feeding people, of sharing food with others, that was something that brought me joy. I started having Sophie over on Sunday afternoons, and we'd make pasta from scratch. She'd stand on a stool at the counter. She was too tall for it now, really, but she did it anyway, and we'd roll out the dough together. She'd tell me about school, about boys she liked, about the ways that being a teenager was nothing like she'd expected it to be. One Sunday, Sophie asked me if I was ever angry at her mother, if I resented her for everything that happened. I thought about that question very carefully before I answered. I said, Catherine was scared. She was afraid that I would take David away from her. She was afraid that I would be a bad influence. She was afraid that your grandfather had abandoned your grandmother for shallow reasons, and that perhaps men did that. And if men did that, what did that mean for her? What did that mean for her marriage? So she did what frightened people do. She attacked the person who represented her fear, and that was me. Sophie was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's not her fault though, is it? Being scared doesn't give her the right to be mean." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Being scared doesn't give anyone the right to be cruel. But understanding what scared her helps me forgive her. And I need to forgive her, Sophie. Because if I don't, I'm still letting her control my emotional life, and I've spent enough years controlled by other people's decisions." If you've ever healed after heartbreak, tap heart symbol so I know I'm not alone. Because healing is the longest journey I've ever taken. It's not a destination you arrive at. It's a practice you return to, over and over, every single day. Robert died 18 months after the trial. He had another heart attack, this one in his sleep, and he just didn't wake up. The night he died, David called me, and I could hear the tears in his voice. I said, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry you're in pain." He said, "Are you sad that he's gone?" I thought about Robert. I thought about all of it, the marriage, the leaving, the Bethany years, the hospital bed, the forgiveness. I said, "I'm sad that he never got to be fully happy. I'm sad that he spent so much of his life running from himself that he never got to just be at peace. But I'm not sad that he's gone. I'm sad that he wasted so much time being afraid." We had a funeral. It was quiet and small. Eleanor Tucker came. She'd become my friend, actually. We'd gotten coffee a few times after the trial, and we'd realized that we had something in common beyond our shared experience of being defrauded. We had both become invisible to the world, and then we'd found each other. We'd both discovered that being invisible had taught us how to see. We'd both learned that the people who matter most aren't the ones who make a big show of loving you. They're the ones who show up, quietly and consistently, even after everything has fallen apart. At Robert's funeral, Eleanor took my hand and she said, "You know, I used to be so angry at my husband for leaving me to Bethany's family, for being gullible, for being vain enough to believe that a young woman could actually love him." I squeezed her hand. She continued, "But now I realize something. My husband didn't fail me. He just showed me what happens when someone loses touch with who they really are. And that's a gift, actually, because it taught me never to lose touch with myself." David stood up and spoke about his father. He talked about the man Robert had been before everything fell apart. He talked about the father who used to make him laugh, the husband who had once known how to love. And then he said something that made me cry. He said, "My father wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who was afraid. And that fear cost him everything. But before he died, he told my mother, his ex-wife, the woman he'd abandoned, he told her that he was proud of her. He told her that she was the strongest person he'd ever known. And he meant it. And I think that's important. I think that in the end, even though he couldn't live his life differently, he could at least see the truth about her. And maybe that's the closest thing to redemption some of us get." I looked at my old friend, and I realized that forgiveness isn't just about forgiving other people. It's about forgiving yourself for the times you've abandoned people too, for the times you've been afraid, for the times you've chosen comfort over loyalty. I said, "Ellen, I forgive you. But I also need you to understand something. I don't need you anymore. And that's okay. You don't get to abandon me and then reclaim me just because you're ready to feel better about it. But if you want to be present going forward, if you want to actually be my friend now, with all the ways that I've changed, with all the ways that I've been through things you don't fully understand, if you can do that, then I'd like to know you again." Ellen cried, and I held her hand, but I didn't comfort her the way I would have before. I let her sit with her own tears. And then she said, "I can do that. We've had tea every Tuesday for the past 6 months. We don't talk about the past anymore. We talk about the present, and it's different than before. It's quieter. It's more honest. It's real in a way that our old friendship maybe never was. Grandmas deserve respect and love. Share this so everyone remembers that. Because I'm a grandmother now, not just in title, but in reality. Sophie trusts me. Sophie comes to me with her heartbreaks and her hopes. Sophie watches how I move through the world, and she learns from it. And that is the greatest inheritance I could have ever left behind. Not money, not property, not anything material, but the knowledge that a woman can be abandoned and still choose to stand. That she can be betrayed and still choose to heal. That she can be invisible and still matter. I'm 80 years old now. I wake to the sound of birds. I tend my garden. I have tea with my friend. I spend Sunday afternoons with my granddaughter. I've learned that the truest wealth a person can have is the ability to wake up and choose peace, to choose dignity, to choose herself even when everyone has told her she's not worth choosing. Last week, David asked me if I regretted anything, if I would do things differently if I could go back, and I said yes. I would regret a lot of things. I would regret the years I spent making myself smaller. I would regret the time I wasted trying to make people love me who didn't know how. I would regret ever believing that my worth was tied to my husband's choice or my family's opinion or my appearance or my age. But I also said that I wouldn't change anything. Because everything that happened, all the pain, all the betrayal, all the invisibility, everything that happened is what taught me how to be who I am now. If this story touched your heart, like and comment to honor your own journey. Because I know that not everyone listening to this has lived through something like what I've lived through. But I know that everyone has felt invisible at some point. Everyone has been betrayed by someone they loved. Everyone has wondered if they matter. And I'm here to tell you that you do. That you matter. That your story matters. That your pain matters. That your strength matters. I sit in my garden sometimes, and I look at the roses that took 3 years to bloom. And I think about something that Eleanor said to me once. She said, "It took Bethany and my husband and all that pain to teach us who we really are." Maybe that was the point of it all. Maybe we needed to be broken so we could learn how to be whole. And I don't know if I believe in fate or destiny or any kind of cosmic plan. But I do know this, that sometimes, even after betrayal, love still finds a way. Not the romantic love that leaves you for younger women. Not the familial love that abandons you when you need it most. But the love that you have for yourself. The love that survives. The love that rebuilds. The love that wakes up every morning and tends the garden, knowing that something beautiful might bloom if you're patient enough to wait. What would you do if life gave you a second chance to reclaim peace? Because that's what this has been. A second chance. A chance to be who I actually am. A chance to live for myself instead of for everyone else. A chance to discover that the woman everyone called a burden was actually strong enough to save them all. And maybe that's the real love story here. Not the romance with Robert. Not the betrayal with Bethany. But the love story between a woman and herself. The story of learning, finally, that she was always enough. She was always worthy. She was never invisible at all. She was just waiting for someone to see her. And that someone, in the end, was herself.